About 3 months back, Axel Brockman from NCBS Bangalore came up with the idea of having webinars on bees and pollinators. After a couple of Zoom meetings, Axel, Hemorrha Hemorrhoidalis from ISA Trivandrum, Parthiba Basu from Calcutta University, Joby Joseph from Hyderabad University, and I thought that we can have a series of webinars from well-known workers in the area, and that we can make it a weekly affair. In the first edition, which is on perspectives for research on pollination, we have listed 9 speakers. Last Friday, we had a wonderful talk by Alisa Stewart from Mahidol University, Thailand. Today, we are having the second talk in the series by Paul Williams. I have the privilege of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Paul Williams. Paul is with the Natural History Museum, London. He has been working on bumblebees since the early 1980s. He has been interested in their taxonomy, distribution, and ecology. His first quantitative description in the 1980s linked regional declines of bumblebees in Britain with global climate change and changes in floral diversities and densities. He has been working on threat status of bumblebees for IUCN Red List assessment. This has led to understand the susceptibility of specialist high alpine and high Arctic bumblebees to climate warming. Paul has a long-standing interest in taxonomy, phylogeny, and biogeography of bumblebees. He has worked extensively on bumblebees of the Himalayas, and today he will be speaking on Himalayan bumblebees, what we know and what we need to know. I request all participants to keep their microphones and videos muted. There will be a couple of short breaks during the lecture for questions. Please unmute your microphone before asking a question. Now I request Paul.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bellavati. That's very kind. I'm very grateful, very honored to be included in this. And apologies to those of you who may have heard some of this before. So let me see if I can share with you my screen, first of all. My entire screen. Yes, share. There we go. Right. And then let's see if we can, forgive me for not being as familiar with this technology as I should be. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can now see the first slide and that you can see my cursor moving around pointing at things. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great,
Yes,
okay. Splendid. So I'm going to talk about bumblebees, say something about what we know and what we need to know. Great. The talk is going to be in 3 parts. The first part I'll start with is Himalayan bumblebees, discovering species and diversity. And that will probably go on for about 20 minutes. And then there'll be these 2 other sections. So I'll be very happy to take questions between those. So Himalaya, in the sense I'm going to talk about, is really the area within this red line. So it's stretching from Pakistan in the west through Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan to Arunachal Pradesh in the east. My experience of the Himalaya really started in 1980, and here's one of the places I spent some time. Particularly, this is Gulmarg in the Pir Panjal range of Kashmir. This is a very well-known site for bumblebees because it's the type locality of a number of species and other taxa. And it's a very nice place to go, highly recommended. And then moving westwards across the Great Himalaya range with, this is the Zojilar Pass and Gumri nearby, me with my bee net, to the Trans-Himalaya, the more arid hinterland, through the Zanskar ranges and up into the high mountains here at Nimmerling. So this is viewed from about 5,000 meters towards the peak over here at 6,400. Amazing places. Bumblebees. Why bumblebees? Well, bumblebees are large, hairy, brightly colored bees. They're common and easy to catch, so they're easy to work with. You can catch them, you can label them, and you can send them on their merry way and watch what they do. They're relatively easy to separate from other bees because, with the exception of the honeybee, they're easy to recognize by the females. When they collect pollen, they store it on their hind legs in these pollen baskets, which consist of the hind femur with a flattened outer side, and then these long combs, these long fringes of bristles, which form the basket on either side. The males don't collect pollen in the same way, but they do still often have a flat, shiny area on the hind legs, so it's not so difficult to recognize them. The challenge with working with bumblebees is that the different species can be very closely similar in color pattern. You get these local mimetic convergences, often between distantly related species. And anybody who's worked in the Himalaya will probably be familiar with this one, Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis, which is very common in the lower forest. But they may or may not have realized that amongst it, there's other species like this Bombus albopluralis, which look virtually identical and are quite difficult to separate. When you get your eye in, this particular one has a few extra yellow hairs on the third segment, which are not there in Hemorrhoidalis. But the interesting thing is that Hemorrhoidalis belongs to this group here, and albopluralis belongs to a different group here, and they're distantly related with lots of other species with very different color patterns. And if you look at this evolutionary tree derived from 5 different genes, but now largely corroborated by a lot of other genes, we can find across all of the bumblebees at least 2 other species here, which again have identical color patterns. These are pretty much the only ones that do, and these also occur in the lower elevation West Himalayan forest. So you get these convergences, and we can map across the world the numbers of species with particular color patterns in particular areas. And the bee we've just been looking at, which we'll characterize as black, yellow, red, the frequency of bumblebees with that color pattern is much at its greatest in the Himalaya, actually in the lower forest, as I was saying. And if you go up to the alpine zones above that, then you see, for example, this color pattern with the white bands and the abdomen with white, yellow, red, white. Now, there are many of these different groups. Here's another one just to prove that they don't all look the same. This is a bee that's largely yellow, and this is very much associated with grasslands in the north, the northern steppe zone. And by looking at the distributions of richness with these different color patterns, you can do statistics on it and show that they are, within a particular color pattern, highly significantly associated for most of these groups. This is an interesting group because it's by far the commonest color pattern in the eastern North America, but then you also get it curiously in the Himalaya. To add to the fun, on top of this, species are often also very variable. So here's one of the species that occurs in the lower Himalayan forests, Bombus breviceps, with the black, yellow, red pattern. And yet, relatively close in South China, you get these things with these bright orange patterns, which are, it turns out, when we look at various genes, virtually identical. These are the same species, but converging on different color patterns in different regions. And many of the other species, like Hemorrhoidalis, will show this color pattern in this region, for example. So color patterns, people like to use them a lot for identifying things, but they have their problems. So to begin to describe bumblebees of the Himalaya, one of the most obvious things to do is to make transects both across the mountains and along the mountains, and to look at what you find in the different places. So here's a transect across Kashmir, the Pir Panjal range, across the Great Himalaya range, across Zanskar, Ladakh, and into the Karakoram. And as we follow across there and look at the bumblebee species present, we can see that some species are present only on the outside, others only on the inner part, and that some of the species, in fact, change color pattern, shown by these little symbols, as we go along the transect. Here's an example of one of those. This is Bombus asiaticus, and in the Pir Panjal range, in the outer ranges, you see these bees. In fact, in many of these green forested areas, you see these bees with white stripes and a black band between the wings. We get as far as the Great Himalaya and just over into the beginning of the arid zone, and the white is replaced by yellow, but still a black band between the wings. And then we get into the arid hinterland of Zanskar and Ladakh, and the thorax becomes plain yellow with no black band. Now, both morphology and the genes show that these are all the same species. So this is just variation within a species. We can describe this in much more detail than that, and we can relate it to variation in 2 dimensions across places like Kashmir. So this sort of work is how a lot of the study of these bees and the knowledge of the species begins, and has done for a couple of hundred years. And then to this we can begin to add transects up and down mountains to look at the elevational distribution of the species, look at the faunal change with elevation. So this is the result of 3 years of work putting transects up and down Mount Afawat in Kashmir. And at the bottom here, we have the distribution of foraging females looking for food of various species in different elevational bands. And this is broadly the 2 bands of forest. And we find species that are particularly associated with the very lowest forest, like Similamus, species like Miniatus that you find broadly in the forests, particularly the upper forest. And then species like Rufo-fasciatus, which is primarily above the forest in the subalpine and alpine. One of the really interesting things coming out of this was that the males are a little bit more restricted in their distributions in where they go to seek for mates, which is presumably a reflection of where receptive females are. So you find patrolling species in the forest, and particularly in the upper forest, and then you find territorial species like Rufo-fasciatus in the open areas and on the mountain tops above. So we're beginning to look not only in the 2 dimensions, latitude and longitude, but also in the vertical dimension. We can put all this information together, in this case from 79 sites sampled in Kashmir, and do a review of the fauna of what's going on in that part of the Himalaya. And this work was extended into Nepal a few years later. This is working with colleagues from Japan to collaborate to look at a whole range of different collections in different places. And here's a map for one of those species from Nepal. This is our friend Hemorrhoidalis again, which varies from light-colored patterns in the west to darker patterns in the east. And the map shows colored circles where there are records for the species and little gray blobs where there are records for other bumblebee species, but not this one. The fact that most of these blobs are orange or yellow shows that this is predominantly a low elevation bumblebee. And in fact, the higher elevation sites, you don't get this one at all. So this is the basic work. And behind that, we need to know a lot about the variation of bumblebees worldwide. We need to know about the various names, which reflect species and color patterns. And here's part of a database of 3,000 names that was used as a background for this study. A summary of this was published as a checklist list of bumblebees worldwide in 1998. And this can be used for doing a number of other things as well. We can look back at species recognized for morphology as recognized in 1998 and look at when they were described. And this is the cumulative curve here. And you can see that most of the descriptions were in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So it then slows off, which gives the impression that at least as far as morphological species are concerned, we know pretty much what's out there. May not be a complete picture. The other thing that we can begin to do is to map the distributions of the different species, create a map for each species and then add them together to look at where the diversity of species is across the globe. The way that's done, of course, is to add up the number of species in different areas. And so as the areas get bigger, you get more species. So what's been done in this map is to keep the areas constant. These are equal area grids across the entire globe. That makes the area, the the figures a little bit more comparable. They're very large equal areas, which at first sight seems to be not a good way to go because it seems to lose a lot of information. But the problem is that it takes a lot of sampling to get close to the point where you think you know most of the species in an area. So the more areas you have, if you have lots and lots of little tiny areas, then it takes a huge amount of work, and the amount of sampling is just doesn't support that. So these very large good cells are chosen to be equal area and to be probably fairly representative of the total numbers of species. We can talk about that. What does it show? Well, we see a lot of species in the Himalaya, and we see a lot of species in the Central Asian mountains and in the mountains in southern Europe. We also see species richness in the western mountains of the New World. That's fun. That's not quite what I expected. There we go. But interestingly, there's also this stripe across here that represents high species richness in northern grasslands, the grassland steppe zone. So basically, bumblebees are most diverse, it seems, from the data we have, in mountains and in subarctic grasslands. From that checklist, it was possible to distill down in 2004 a sort of short catalogue of the bumblebees of the Himalaya. And this is pretty much what was adopted by Professor Saini for his Bumblebees of India, and more recently, Martin Stranzer has used it to look at Dr. Stranzer has used it to look at the very poorly known fauna of Arunachal Pradesh in the east. Big advance there. Since this work based on a morphological concept of species was done, there's been a lot of recent progress in revising species. Now, revising species is not straightforward. To do this well, ideally, we need to follow 5 principles of best practice. We need to start with an explicit statement of what a species means to us. This is important because we need to know what we're looking for. We can't be clear about what we're finding unless we set out what it is we're looking for. Probably the most important point is that these revisions need to be done in the context of revising an entire monophyletic group globally. That means looking at all the descendants of a particular common ancestor. You can't do it for part of a group in part of its distribution, because the context of the entire group is necessary for the methods to work well to recognize species appropriately. And there's no single method that is guaranteed to identify species reliably. There are a variety of methods, a variety of sources of information, and we need to try several of those and to then compare the results to look for corroboration. If we find that we have multiple approaches and all of them or most of them support a particular conclusion, then we can be a little bit more confident that that's probably closer to the truth in some sense. And finally, we want to give names to these species, and those names are attached to type specimens and collections. So you need to go to the collections, you need to look at the type specimens. And particularly when you're using molecular methods, you need an accountable method to link those type specimens to the samples in your study. And that's a whole barrel of fun. So to pick up on the point about complete taxon sampling, this can be challenging when there are areas which are difficult to get to. So here's me looking happy because I'm up here in the Kunlun Mountains in northern Tibet, looking at some very strange bumblebees from these very isolated ancient mountain ranges, which are very important for giving a context to understanding the faunas in other areas like the Himalaya. So this is very, very important to cover all of these regions. I was able to do this because I was working with collaborators from China, some colleagues from China, on Bumblebees of China. And my role in this was primarily to identify thousands and thousands of bumblebees that they brought back every year from surveys all over the country and try and sort out what they were looking at so that we could put that together. Looking at where this gets us, we're looking here at the Himalayan bumblebee fauna, which broadly defined, occupies this area shown in green in the Himalaya and Southeast Asia. And looking at the context of contrasting faunas in the Tibetan Plateau region, in Southeast China, in North China, and in Central Asia. So we have to understand how these things relate to one another. We've been very, very fortunate that in the last 20 years, there's been an increasing availability of data from genes, gene sequences, and these provide a lot of characters for assessing the relationships amongst our samples. An example of this is the use of gene coalescence to try and recognize species. That's a complicated subject, and I'm only going to mention this very, very much in outline. But if we have a set of samples, so if we look at a fast evolving gene, which might give us a good chance of finding differences between closely related recent species, we look at sequences from a fast evolving gene like CO1 and its standard barcodes, we can take our sequences, we can run them through a procedure to give us an estimate of the evolutionary relationships between those samples. And tracing back that estimate, which is usually expressed as a tree, we tend to find coalescence between short branches, little clusters, which are generally interpreted as species, and then very long branches between those coalescence, which are interpreted as the relationships between those species. I'm skating over a whole lot of problems, but that is broadly the outline of it. How does this apply in practice? Well, there's been a lot of debate in the past about the status of various things and whether or not they're different species or not. And particularly with bumblebees being so variable in color pattern, there's a lot of arguments. Some people say that they are different species, some people say they aren't. And it has come down a lot of the time to authority. People just make assertions, and if they're well enough published, then people tend to follow them. But now we're able to look much more at assessing evidence quantitatively and looking at here the Seychelles complex of bumblebees, which is widespread across Europe and Asia. This includes yellow-banded bees, white-banded bees, bees with orange tails, bees with white tails. Then the genes support these all being a single, very variable species. No good evidence that these things are more than one species. In contrast, here's another group, Cariensis group, very similar age, very similar sort of range, extent, and it goes almost into Europe and it's widespread in Asia. But the genes support there being 6 separate species. Those are mapped here with the different colored dots, and the tree shows the relationships between them. Again, there are yellow-banded bees and white-banded bees. And in some cases, these things are very similar in appearance. These are cryptic species. It's very difficult to tell them apart. And there's been arguments since back at the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly in the middle of the 20th century, as to whether these were the same species or separate species. But now looking back at the genes that are really quite distinct, we can see that which color characters are actually diagnostic for these things and which are not. So it turns out that differences in the breadth of the black band on the top of the thorax, this one's wider, this one's narrower, mean nothing. They're very variable. It doesn't tell you anything about the underlying species according to the genes. But on the other hand, the presence of just a few yellow hairs on the leg bases is diagnostic between these two species throughout their range. Bringing this all back together and thinking about the Himalaya specifically, and looking at our various regions within the Himalaya, we can then plot the numbers of species in each region. And surprise, surprise, you find the largest numbers of species in Nepal and in Kashmir, because that's where the revisions have concentrated. So you find species where you look for them. No big deal there. But many of the species are quite patchy. And it's not surprising that you can come up with a set of rules to interpolate the expected distributions of species between these patches. And if you come up with those rules, whether just rules that you write down or whether they're mathematical models, you can interpolate the expected distributions, and then the richness looks like this, with the maximum in Sikkim. That's not entirely surprising, because if you're interpolating, getting highest richness in the middle is perhaps to be expected. But what it does allow you to do is to break down the fauna into groups, here between a western group of bumblebees and an eastern group of bumblebees. And equally, we could do this between groups at different elevations, groups in different habitats, and so on and so forth. So we can begin to look at what the bumblebees are doing, how they're distributed in relationship to what they're doing. So that's really the introduction I wanted to give on where we are with trying to find out about what's there in terms of species and diversity of bumblebees in the Himalaya. So I would imagine there might be some questions on that.
Yeah, if there are any questions, I think you can raise your hand. There is one. I just... Sinu, I think you can. Sinu is on. He wants to ask a question.
Hi, Sinu.
Yeah. Hi, Paul. It's so nice to listen to your talk again. It's so refreshing. I hope I hope you are doing well too.
Thank you.
My question today is: are you seeing any specific relationship between altitude and the tongue length of a given species and among species? So, for example, in your Bombus asiaticus, you have shown in altitudinal range, the color is varying, but are you seeing a tongue length of this Asiatic species across altitude? And the second one is different species of bumblebees have different the tongue length across altitude. Because I'm a pollination specialist, I just want to know a bit about it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's very interesting question, because as you say, the tongue length has a very strong effect on, as many of you will know, on which flowers the bees will visit. And there's a lot of work being done showing on how highly optimized that relationship is. I haven't measured the tongue lengths on these bees because it's very difficult, as some of you will know. So I can't answer this from absolute authority. But what I could say is that tongue length generally in the phylogeny is highly conserved. So it's unlikely that species are going to be very variable between populations of the same species, between places. But as far as I know, nobody's looked, and so it would be interesting to check that and see what's going on. What's perhaps more likely is that one might find differences in tongue length between assemblages of species at different altitudes. However, the impression I get, and again, I haven't studied this quantitatively, so this is one of the many things that people in the audience can go out and look at. My impression is that what you find is the usual pattern, that you get some very long tongue bees, some intermediate length tongue bees, and some short tongue bees in most assemblages at most elevations. So this is at low elevation, this will be apparent that you get relatively long-tongued bees like Hemorrhoidalis and Alboploralis. You'll get short-tongued bees like Rotundiceps, and you'll get short-tongued bees with mandibles with teeth. That clearly these bees are robbers. I mean, we see this in the field very often, like Breviceps, and they're all co-occurring, visiting different flowers, but looking superficially similar. You can often tell which species you're looking at by which flower it's going to. That was a rambling answer to say that I haven't measured it, but we can make some guesses as to what we'll find.
Paul, I think Paul, I think it's going to be an excellent topic for a future study, I guess. Because these days, as you told, there are a lot of relationship studies, and also the pollination symptom. I mean, this pollinator plant coevolution, and across altitude, the corolla length is getting reduced like that. And I have one more question, if you don't mind. This diversity species richness graph. the neotropics and the North America, South America, and all the latitudinal range, you have the bumblebees. But why it is not in South Asia and Africa?
Right, okay. So we saw from that map that bumblebees are primarily associated with cool environments, especially temperate, north temperate environments. There's a lot of them in mountains. They occur in the upper parts of mountains, especially in the Himalaya above 2,000 meters, but way up as far as there are plants. 5,600 meters, I think, is as far as they've been recorded. I think that's right. But basically, as far as there are plants to support them. So they are very good at working in cool environments, and they get as far north as there is land, basically, in Greenland. What they're not good at, I would suggest, and we can discuss the evidence, is they're not good at dispersing long distances across barriers of unfavorable habitat. So they're not good at flying across deserts, for example, and then being able to establish colonies when they get there. So it's only the queens, probably in the spring, that would be able to found new colonies and start a new population. They've got to get across that desert. They've got to then found a colony. And then the other thing, sort of double whammy, is that you need enough genetic diversity to get across in one season that their progeny will be heterozygous enough that they will have female offspring, they will rear workers, and that the lineages will continue. If there isn't enough genetic diversity in the founder population, then the progeny will all be male, and the whole thing comes to a halt, I'm afraid. So they seem to be very poor at getting across barriers. So even if they could get into Africa in the Atlas Mountains, as they do, they haven't apparently got across the Sahara, and they haven't spread even across the northern Indian plains into the Western Ghats, as far as is known.
Yeah.
So it seems to be this dispersal issue for these cool, temperate insects that's the real problem.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much.
There are a couple of more questions, Paul.
Yep.
Viresh Kumar has raised his hands, I think. Viresh.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Paul, it's a wonderful talk. I have collected this Albopluralis and Hemorrhoidalis from the Himalayan region, from Meghalaya.
Okay. Yeah.
Apart from what you told, that few yellow hairs present on the third segment, I could notice that fourth segment is shorter in Albopluralis compared to Hemorrhoidalis. Is that right?
The fourth segment is
shorter in Albopluralis compared to Hemorrhoidalis. So I could notice that.
Yep. So you're saying that the exoskeleton is shorter. It's shorter from front to back.
Yes, the fourth segment of abdomen.
Okay.
Yeah,
I haven't measured them, so if you found that, then that's interesting.
Yeah.
That should definitely be looked at. One of the problems is that there may well be at least one other species in the subgenus Megabombus, like Albopluralis, present in the Himalaya, and that's proving to be quite a problem. That's something that really needs to be looked at.
Okay, and
so it's confusing. There's complications that need to be ironed out.
Yeah, even with the punctures, also some differences is there in the top of the head. So top of the head with punctures are long in Albopluralis compared to Hemorrhoidalis.
Oh yes. That couldn't be more clear. That Hemorrhoidalis belongs to this group that has a very smooth top to the head with very few punctures.
One question I'm having: what are all the major characters? I mean, morphological characters to identify Indian bumblebees other than the color?
The things that people have used over the last 150 years are primarily the male genitalia, because they are very much more variable than many female characters.
Yes.
And then people And then people look at things like the sculpturing and the exoskeleton on the top of the head and the clypeus and the labrum, things which it sounds like you're already looking at. But the problem is, and this is something that was commented on by Michener in his book on bees, that bumblebees are morphologically pretty similar, especially in the females. So
Yes.
it's a problem.
Yes. Thank you.
If people have access to barcodes, then they can be a very quick way of identifying things much more reliably.
Yeah, true. There's one more question by Shashank.
Yep.
Shashank, you can. Hello.
Sir, please. Is it audible, sir?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Williams. I have just one question. There is a lot of museum data which is available, like because you are in NHM, you might have used a lot of museum data, old specimens which are collected from the same elevations where you have collected for your work.
Yep.
So, how much that museum data you have utilized to compare this, especially the color variations? Anyway, okay, that's it. You can go ahead.
Okay, so there are many thousands of specimens in museum collections, especially in Europe and also in North America from the Himalaya. And this is where a lot of the work, there have been people working in India much more recently, and that's the way it should go. But in the distant past, a lot of the work was done in Europe and North America. And those records, we really want to get those data digitized and sent back to anybody who wants to use it around the world, but especially in India. And I see that as an absolute priority. So I would like to make available whatever data I can from the London collection and so on, and from the collections I've got. I don't know whether that helps.
Yeah, there's another question by Aslam.
Yep.
Aslam. It's not unmuting.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
No. Yeah, hi.
Yeah, come on.
Hello.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm from the South Indian, this part, Kerala. So I have two questions. The first question is, hello. Do people farm this bee? The first, do people farm this bee? If it is so, does it increase in the pollination? Hello?
Right. Yep. Hello. So bumblebees have never been recorded from the south of India, and in India they've really only been recorded from the Himalaya and then from some of the mountains in the northeast. I've, for today's talk, excluded those in the northeast because I don't have a lot of data for it. But we could put that back in to get a more complete picture. But no, as far as we know, there are no bumblebees from the south, and there are other bees and other big bees, big furry bees like Xylocopa, which are responsible for pollination there.
Yeah, I think
I understood, sir. But my question is actually whether people can farm bee, whether people can farm this bee in Himalayan region.
So are you talking about, sorry, my connection may not be good enough. Are you talking about taking bumblebees from the Himalaya and using them in the south?
No, not like that, sir. In Himalaya itself, whether people can farm, is it domesticatable?
Oh, so
like
just
bees.
Within the Himalaya, whether bees are domesticatable? Yes, I would imagine that this should be something of a priority. There are some species which produce large colonies, which visit a lot of plants which are important for crops, and those are the ones which you're likely to want to target. Generally speaking, it's more difficult to rear colonies of bumblebees of the long-tongued species. So species in the north, like Tunicatus in the western Himalaya at least, would be obvious targets for rearing for pollination because they that group of bees is relatively easy to rear. They have large colonies, and their abundance suggests that they should be fairly easy to encourage. In the northeast, that's a more open question as to what would be appropriate, but it might be worth looking at some of the Melanobomba species, for example, which would have similar properties. But I would advise very strongly, and I'll talk about this in a second, about importing exotic bees like Bombus terrestris from Europe. And I'll talk about why in just a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
so the second question is actually, sir, you have in it. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Second question.
Yeah. So, do you have any digital tracker? Do you have any digital tracker to map its movements, sir?
I couldn't hear that. Do I have any small?
No, are there any trackers for tracking the movement of the bumblebee?
Oh, have I been tracking?
Yeah, exactly.
No, I haven't done any work on that. But the people who do, who I know of, are people like Juliet Osborne when she was working at Rothamsted, and there's somebody else who's taken that work over, and they used radar, for example, if that's what you had in mind. But I have no direct experience of that myself, I'm afraid.
Okay, I think you can continue, Paul, with that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So in a shorter second section, I wanted to talk briefly about threats from environmental change, and specifically land use, pesticides, introductions, and climate. So I suppose one of the things that most people have heard about is the adverse effects of land use intensification. And this is something which I think will need a lot more study in the Himalaya. One of the more intriguing, perhaps, examples where I have done some work is looking at Tibetan Yak Herders who were previously nomadic, but because of the attractions of towns have tended to settle around the towns. And yet their yak remain the traditional symbol of wealth. And this results in the yak becoming concentrated around the towns, and then you get overgrazing, loss of flowers, and ultimately loss of bumblebees. And we can see in this picture that the grazing can become quite intense. It doesn't look like a very rich environment for bumblebees. When there's grazing between that affects the vegetation between sort of 3 to 5 years intervals at least, you can actually get a very rich vegetation flora of herbs that support bumblebees, and a lot of bumblebees. This is an area quite close to this one, where the yak are fenced in, and the density is really high, and you can see what effect this has had, causing overgrazing and a reduction in the height of the vegetation. And if we go out and measure the height of the vegetation and count the numbers of species of bumblebees, then not surprisingly, as the height of the vegetation goes down, we find fewer and fewer species of bumblebees. We mentioned introductions, and particularly Bombus terrestris. This is a species that's widespread and abundant in Europe. It's been introduced all over the world for more than a century. It's a very good pollinator of glasshouse crops in Europe. It's very easily available. You can buy colonies that are reared for pollination of tomatoes and so forth. So it would be very easy to move it around the world to other places, including the Himalaya. But where it's been introduced into places like Japan, it's had a bad effect on the local bumblebees through interbreeding, possibly through competition, and also through introduced pathogens. It's also had a devastating effect on some of the spectacular South American bumblebees, where it's been introduced into Chile and Argentina. And the pathogens, at least, if not the bumblebees, were introduced, we believe, though it's not definite, into North America just over 20 years ago. And this had a devastating effect on several species there, catastrophic declines. So introducing this bee, although it's easy because it's relatively cheaply and conveniently available, is probably a very bad idea. Now, we can model the climatic suitability of various areas around the world for Bombus terrestris, and this is a complicated business. There's lots of assumptions, lots of ways of doing it, but many of the, this is just one, many of the ways of doing it agree that the Himalaya are likely to be a highly suitable area for Bombus terrestris. So I would, because of the bad effects that this bee is claimed to have had in Japan and South America particularly, I would advocate that strongly that this bee is not introduced into the Himalaya, and that one looks for local indigenous bees to rear to help with pollination. I think introduction of exotic species and their pathogens is bad news. Something that also that's getting a lot of airtime at the moment is climate change, something that we need to worry about. The region of the Himalaya that's perhaps most unusual is the high elevation, the very high mountains, and the Tibetan plateau beyond. This is an exceptional area worldwide, of course, and this is a map just showing a familiar region above 3,000 meters and quite how large it is. But still has bumblebees. And you might think, oh, well, we don't know much about Tibetan bumblebees, but it turns out that looking at the areas, the provinces overlapping this region, there's more than 32,000 records of bumblebees. And that was just in 2015. There's actually been quite a lot of expeditions since then, collecting very large numbers of bees so that we've got a much better grasp than this map would suggest. Generally speaking, these areas have relatively few species, but are also undersampled. The big hole in the middle may be realistic, that there's a lot of very arid terrain with very little in the way of food plants for bumblebees. Time will tell. We can begin to study what's going on in this fauna by trying to arrange the different samples in relation to variations in their composition. So we're ordering the samples along two axes. We look for what is the sort of biggest axis of variation in sample, in faunal composition among samples on this axis, and then what's the next biggest axis of variation in their composition on the second axis. And we've also thrown into this some of the factors which are climatic factors, which are likely to explain bumblebee distributions. And I'm glossing over an awful lot of detail here just to give you a broad picture. The fact that this is showing some degree of success appears to be borne out by the fact that on this plot, the samples, when ordered purely by their fauna and their climate, are roughly organized into the western samples on the left, the eastern samples on the right, the northern samples at the top, and the southern samples towards the bottom. So there's something in the data which are telling us about where they come from. There's a real pattern there. It's not just a mess. The climate data tell us the sort of thing which is we expect to see, that they west of the Tibetan plateau is characterized by sunny, dry areas. The east of the plateau is characterized by cloudy, wet areas, that you get a lot of summer drought in the north and you get concentrated monsoons in the south. Well, that's not exactly news. But what happens is that if you rerun the analysis with and without the climate data, then the samples shift slightly in the plot. And that shift tells you something about how successful the climate is in explaining the variation in the composition of the fauna. So these lines show us the shift between the two analyses for each of the sites. So a big shift like this shows that in Ladakh, there's a mismatch between the faunal variation and our ability to explain it in terms of the climate. What we find when we look at the overall picture is that these models are least successful in explaining faunal variation from measured water availability in the most arid areas. The most arid areas over towards this side, and these shifts are biggest on the second axis, which is to do with water stress. So it seems to be water that is not being reflected well in terms of these analyses. So are there local factors that explain how climate is failing in these analyses to explain the variation in the fauna in places like Ladakh? And what does this tell us? Well, Ladakh is characterized by having isolated patches with bees. The bees aren't spread out broadly, they're concentrated in little patches which depend on permanent streams to support the plants that then support the bees. And then you have these big gaps of arid areas in between. Meanwhile, we have to bear in mind that these analyses were based on 1 degree grid cells. So these are quite large areas at which the climate and the bees are measured. So is there a hint here as to what's going on? So the climate in the analysis we just looked at was measured at the 1 degree scale, but when we look at the bees within places like Ladakh, they're actually very closely clumped in very small patches which are dependent on these permanent streams. Here are some of those bees, Bombus seminovianus, Bombus asiaticus, and they have this characteristic yellow, black, red color pattern, which then also extends into places like Afghanistan. Looking more closely at an example of one of these places in Zanskar, here we have Nymling Plain with a patch of bumblebees, and they're on flowers, which are watered by a stream that comes from a glacier up near the mountain. It's a permanent stream that comes down the valley, and it's then slowed down by a terminal moraine, which makes a damp area, which is where most of the food plants are. And then we find just 9 species of bumblebees in this tiny area about 200 meters across. And then no bumblebees could be found in these large arid areas all around. So they're very concentrated and they're very dependent on this permanent stream. Looking at that valley, what's apparent is that over the decades, this glacier has been retreating, presumably with climate change, back up the valley. And it's easy to imagine that if climate change becomes, or climate warming in this region becomes more severe, that we could lose the glacier in parts in the late summer and then lose the glacial stream for short parts of the summer at least. And if that leads to a loss of the food plants, then you could lose the bumblebees in these areas, which would not be good at recolonizing each year because they have to come a very long way and bumblebees aren't good at dispersing. That's not likely to happen. So these little patches of bumblebees could be very fragile to loss of glaciers. Something to think about. So that's the second part, just thinking about very broadly and quickly about some of the threats from environmental change to bumblebees. I'm sure that was very clear, so there must be questions about that.
Yeah, we will have just 2 questions now. Avinash Chauhan raised hands. Avinash? Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Sir, my microphone is muted from your side.
No,
can you hear me? I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good.
No, we are able to hear you. You can ask the question, please.
Sir, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Yeah.
Sir, actually, my name is Dr. Avinash Chauhan, and I am working on bumblebees from last 11 years, sir. So
good to meet you.
Earlier, I have worked in northern part of Himalayas, where I found Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis as the main dominant species.
Right.
Rather than Bumblebees trifasciatus, rufifasciatus, or Bumblebees esmensis, sir.
Okay.
And now I am working in Nagaland, is northeastern part of India, and I found the bee similar to Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis. And in one slide, I have seen that there is some morphological difference between the two bees, but they are only Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis. Is it possible, sir? Here also Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis dominant.
Yes, it's very possible, but it's a question of needing to have a look at the bees or looking at their barcodes to to be sure, because anything is possible, and we just need to make sure from actual observations exactly what we're looking at, because sometimes very odd things turn up where they're not expected. You might expect to find a particular species. You might find something that looks like that species, but when you actually look closely at it, you find out that it's something else. So it's always necessary to check, and that would be very interesting to do in your case. Yes.
Okay, sir. Sir, I also want to add one thing. That earlier Dr. Aslam, he have asked about the rearing of bumblebees. So I must say that Bumblebees of China can be reared easily. I have reared it for 3 years. Yeah.
Splendid. Splendid. That's good news.
Continuously 3 years I have reared this Bumblebees of China. And if you want to inquire about it, you can contact the Dr. Vice Parma University Horticulture and Forestry. Still the work is going on there on bumblebee domestication.
Yeah. Great. Well, I would hope that in the not too distant future, it will be possible to have meetings either online or face to face, in which we discuss rearing of bumblebees, which species, how it's done, and also, of course, how to manage habitats for these things.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Then we move on to Dr. Chandish. Please raise the hand. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Belwadi. Thank you, Dr. William. That was a brilliant presentation. I have just one question. You were mentioning that a lot of data is available based on the museum specimens and NHM and other museums. And with that data and from your studies and what is going on right now in India by the Indian taxonomists, is it possible to arrive at if there is any loss in the diversity of Himalayan bumblebees, and if there is any loss in species richness, or is there a need to take up fresh studies to understand if there is a biodiversity loss? Because that's a question which is being constantly asked, whether there's a loss in the diversity of bumblebees.
Right, right. I'm going to talk in the next section about surveys of distribution and so forth. I think it's really, really important that we people in India put together a database to keep track of all the information, and that, you know, all the information that's available in other institutions around the world about Indian bumblebees should come to that database, so that you can look at it all in comparison with new surveys and see what's going on with your fauna. And I'm very keen that that is something that is encouraged. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute.
Thank you, Dr. William.
Pleasure.
Yeah, Paul, you can move on to the next part. Yeah.
Okay, so the third final section, fairly short. I wanted to talk about the need, which I hope is fairly obvious, to gather more information to see what's going on with these bees, what you've got and where it's going. So survey distribution, revised species, and management. So the most important thing is to begin by knowing what you've got and where it is. And so what we need is a survey of the bumblebees of the Himalaya of India. And I imagine that would look something like the Butterflies of India survey, but that there are always variations on this. But that's roughly what we're aiming towards, the idea of getting a database where you can go to find available information on the distribution of the different species. Now, in order to do that, you need to be able to identify the species. And so one of the things I was hoping to do was to make available a free guide to help to identify them, because it's not easy, unfortunately, as many of you will know. And this is something that's pretty much there, and I will hope to get this finished very soon. But it will have, it's not focusing at the moment so much on photographs, but it will show the color variation within species. It'll show the morphology. It'll give you at least a very crude summary of the distribution, both spatially across the Himalaya and by habitat and elevation within the mountains. So that's the next step there. But as a result of the information of people going out and surveying in India, we will find a lot more information about the variation of the bees. And no doubt it will be necessary to revise our ideas of the species themselves. A number of problems are already known, but others may well come up. One of the things which I think needs to be emphasized is that taxonomic revisions can only be done properly if you do it on a very large scale. You need to look at the complete sample of the complete group worldwide, and this needs collaboration among countries. Here's an example of a recent revision of Melanobombus. There's quite a lot of species of Melanobombus in the Himalaya. These are the sites from which samples were sequenced, and it was moving particularly towards concentrating on sites in Asia. And over the last decade, the number of species recognized from these analyses of sequences was increasing as we got more sequences and then leveled off. And it seems that this is a fairly good indication if you are getting enough representation of the variation, if you're getting a stable solution, that we're getting to a point where we're probably understanding the species reasonably well. That's debatable, but it's a good stopping rule. So we need to get people to work together. There are many problems that persist. And just as one example of this is slightly lost on my screen. Parthenius group of bumblebees, these are bees of the Himalaya and Hengduan mountains. They're small, grayish, subtropical, so low elevation bees. Not particularly well represented in collections, usually small numbers. And working with colleagues in many different countries, over the last 10 years, I managed to get together a series of 165 samples of these things which show 40 different forms of this CO1 gene. And then we can use various techniques to get estimates of the evolutionary tree for these bees, and then we can use the coalescent techniques for indicating where species are likely to be on this tree. So broadly, you get many of the sorts of results you expect to get. You find species like Infirmus, Lemniscatus, Parthenius, good Himalayan species, and then other Chinese species like Avanus and so forth. But there are others that pop out on long branches, which are a slight surprise. I've got bees here from Bhutan, from Vietnam, from China, from Nepal. There will be some from India. There's duplicates to some of these things. And it would be very easy to jump to the conclusion that these are new species of bumblebees. Let's rush out and give them names. But there's a real problem. Is that really what's going on? You can only know by doing more sampling and finding out whether the new samples add in little terminal clusters on this tree as parts of these groups as real new species, or whether they fill in the gaps between them and you get a coalescence into a much larger species. They all turn out to be the same thing. But because they're from Bhutan, Vietnam, Nepal, China, India, wherever, no one country can do this on its own. It's got to be a collaboration across different countries. Only when we get that going can we find out whether these things like this one from South China really is a new species or not. So that's something to aim for on species revision. We need to improve distribution models. And we need models because we need to know how things are going to react to change in the future. So for Mandakibommus, which is a group of bumblebees that specialize in particularly high elevation habitat, these are things that you find on mountaintops. Here are records for Mandakibommus, particularly well sampled as these little spots on the map. The background of the map is colored using a model for climatic suitability. So the green areas are not very suitable, the brown areas are supposedly highly suitable. And generally speaking, you see the spots are on the brown areas that are expected to be suitable. But some areas that are expected to be suitable have no records. There may be at least 4 reasons for this, and this shows where we need to be going. It could be that the sampling of the bees is not adequate, and certainly this is an area that's not well visited, but it has been visited, so that's not entirely satisfying as an explanation. It could be that the data for the climate are not good enough, that the climate here is not as shown in the climate variables. That might seem surprising, but this is a real problem in mountain areas because the climate variables themselves are heavily interpolated. They are heavily modeled. people don't have climate weather stations on every mountain and every slope. They have them in a few places, and then they use models to interpolate. And that relies on understanding how rain shadow effects work, and how the direction a mountain faces has an effect on this, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of complexity in how the climate data are generated, a lot of uncertainty that needs to be addressed. Much better data are needed. There may be other habitat factors that need to be included in the model that are crucial for the presence or absence of a species, but which are not present in the simple models at the moment. The most obvious of these may be the presence or absence of particular food plants. In bumblebees generally, because they have colonies that last for many months through the summer, they can't usually afford, let's say, to specialize on single plant species. They have a succession of plant species they depend on through the season. Those cases where they are highly specialized is usually when they're in such extreme habitats that there's only one plant species that's available in numbers for the entire season. So it may be that there are particular plant species which are crucial. They may not be crucial in the sense that the bee absolutely has to have that one and nothing else will do, but it may just be that that's the only one that tends to be in those areas and available in large numbers at that time. So there's a lot to be researched there. And as we said earlier, there's the question of dispersal. It may be that this area truly is suitable, but that the bees have either failed to get there, or they did get there, but now they've been extirpated, they've gone extinct locally, but they can't get back. So all of these things need to be understood a lot better before we can get models which can tell us how the bees will react to change. At the moment, because there's lots of different models and people don't fully understand which are good models and which are bad models, they tend to use an ensemble approach to look for agreements between the different models. But maybe we can move towards getting better models so that we can be more selective about the models that we use. And ultimately, finally, and perhaps most important, we need to look much more at how to manage areas for bumblebees. This is an example of an early management case from Britain, where the Bumblebee Conservation Trust literally took a brownfield site and took it into and changed it, managed it for plants that were good for bumblebees, and ended up with a very rich bumblebee fauna that was much enhanced by their management procedure. So this is a bumblebee sanctuary. But let's recognize that people have been doing this in Ladakh, for example, for 1,000 years. Here's an example of a field that is there only because of irrigation and medicago, which has several species of bumblebees, which certainly wouldn't be there if it were left unmanaged, if it were left as desert. So there's enormous importance, enormous potential for learning from local knowledge throughout the Himalaya on how to manage habitat to increase bumblebees and pollination. And that, I think, is the most important point. So in conclusion, we already know very roughly, very approximately what the species are and where they're found. But what we need to know now, in order to conserve bumblebees and to develop pollination resources, is to get a better grasp of the species and the distributions. We need to get a better grasp of factors governing the distributions, which factors determine whether or not, or affect whether or not a species is likely to be present or not. And we need to get better data and methods for modeling how distributions might change with some of these factors. The next steps to trying to achieve these things are primarily to get some surveys going, to record species across the Himalaya and get improved databases that can be used as a resource for exploring some of these questions and some of these problems. There will inevitably be questions about some of the species and understanding them better, because some of them, there may still be species there that we don't know about. And this can really only be resolved properly, I would argue, by having collaborative teams across countries so that we bring in information from related bees from other neighboring areas in Southeast Asia, in China, in Central Asia, and beyond, and some of the expertise from some of those areas in looking at them. And ultimately, as I've been emphasizing in this last section, we need improved models for predicting change, not only in the environment, but also in the bumblebees and how they respond. We need high resolution data and the best methods for analyzing those data. So I'd like to say thank you to all of those who've helped in the development of this and all the other work by collecting specimens and maintaining collections. These are absolutely fundamental. So people have helped with supporting collecting trips. They've helped by producing collecting additional specimens and samples. They've given access to collections all around the world. They've helped in obtaining gene sequences, particularly CO1 barcode sequences in various places. And of course, many thanks to all of those who've supported travel to India, particularly the NCBS. And I imagine there might be some more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Paul. I think the first question is by Hema Somanathan. Hema, I think you should unmute your...
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay. I can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. That was fantastic. I have a question about, would it be right if I were to say that the Himalayas are the most diverse in terms of bumblebee species? Would that be a right statement?
This is always depends on the scale at which you measure it. So at the scale of those grid cells that I showed on that map, these very large grid cells, so as a sort of regional scale, if you like, you can say that the Himalaya and the Hengduan Mountains and those mountains that go up into Gansu in China, that area as a whole is definitely the highest. If you zoom in and say which patch of ground 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers is the highest, then goodness knows, because it could be anywhere within that, or indeed it could in practice, in principle, be somewhere else, because the diversity depends critically on the scale at which you measure it. But I think in very broad terms, you're safe in saying that the Himalaya and the adjacent areas of China are together the greatest center of richness, diversity worldwide.
Yeah. And related to that, what are the current hypotheses that are attributed to this diversity? Is it to do? I remember you mentioned in your talk about reduced dispersibility in many species. So does that have? Is this something that features prominently among several hypotheses, maybe competing hypotheses?
There's likely to be a number of factors in this. This is, we were talking about historical patterns, historical events. These are things that are one-offs, so you can't do experiments on them. But it's likely to be that this is a region that has had bumblebees for the longest time. So there's been a long time for speciation to occur and for species to accumulate. Mountain regions also tend to have a lot of species because you get speciation between ranges as climate changes come and go. And so there's a lot of factors going into this. But the fact that bumblebees have a very long history in this region for their group and that it is a very mountainous region, those are two of the most important factors, I'm sure.
Okay. Can I ask another question, Belawadi? So is there any estimate of foraging ranges for the Himalayan bumblebees?
Not that I know of. There may be other people listening who've measured this. I don't know. The only thing I can say is that in Kashmir, in the spring, one might find at the top of the forest, in the sort of subalpine scrub, there will be a number of species which were searching for nest sites, and then in the middle of the summer, you'd find those bees foraging around there, and as you would expect. But then suddenly, at the end of the summer, you'd find other species appearing there, which you hadn't seen all summer. I'm thinking particularly of Bombus similimus, which is very much more associated with areas 1,000 meters below in terms of elevation. So it's sort of in the valley bottoms. And what seems to have happened is that the lower areas dried out, and the bumblebees from those lower areas, and they're in nests that can't move. So presumably the nests of Similimus are down below, and I have seen them at that elevation. So the bees are then commuting from their low elevation dry sites way up the mountains to the subalpine sites that are still wetter. So from that, you can begin to see that these bees can move several kilometers at least in order to forage. But apart from that, I don't know that anybody's measured it. Other people here may be able to answer that better.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, and the next one to ask question is Parthiv Basu. Parthiv.
Hi, Paul. Hello.
Hi.
Paul, hi. Hi. Good to meet again.
Yes.
Virtual. And lovely talk, of course. Part of it I have heard before. Yes. But so my question is kind of similar to Hema's, really. Wondering about, she was asking about the diversity, species diversity-wise, how does Himalaya look like? My question is there any clue about the phylogenetic diversity of bumblebees across Himalayas, and how do you compare, whatever the data, phylogenetic data you might have, can you compare Himalayan phylogenetic diversity with other part of the globe?
Right. Let me see. I may actually be able to answer this live on air. Phylogenetic diversity was something that our group got started on measuring back in the 1990s, early 1990s. And so I actually have it plumbed into the software that I use to plot distribution maps. So if we just adjust the scale here. Right, so there's our map of species richness. Can you see that?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So if I now go to this one, there's a map of phylogenetic diversity for bumblebees, and it looks very similar to the map of species diversity. In fact, I can compare the two if this is going to probably just confuse people, but if I swap that map into the background, plot another map of richness, and then overlay the two using a two color scale, they're highly correlated. So you can see by the fact that most of the points are on the diagonal, that they are very highly correlated between richness and phylogenetic diversity. What this translates into in color is that the blue areas show an excess of phylogenetic diversity over species richness, and the green shows an excess of richness over phylogenetic diversity. So a green area has relatively speaking, a lot of closely related species, and the blue area has a lot of species that are more different to one another than you would expect. And the difference is not enormous. They're pretty much on the diagonal. There's not a lot going on. And the reason for that is pretty much the same as we find in many data sets, that most of the major groups of bees are in most of the areas. So if you think of the tree, really the differences are in the twigs. Differences between areas are in the twigs rather than in the major boughs.
Yeah.
So the phylogenetic diversity can fine-tune that, but it's not giving you a very, very different story.
That's interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
So even like the graph that you showed, the species richness kind of declines in terms of human pressure, etc., or that altitudinal gradient wise. In one of your sort of presentation slides. So along different altitudes or across various regions of Himalayas. So they also correlate, the species richness and the phylogenetic diversity also.
Yeah, I would imagine. I don't have those data because we don't have good high-resolution data for the distribution of bumblebees across the Himalaya yet. We can't do that yet, but I would imagine that would be what you would get. Well, another thing that you can, and I don't want to digress too much, you can measure here is the sort of range size rarity of the species in the different grid cells. So here we've got high scores for areas that have a lot of narrowly distributed species. And we can actually divide through by the number of species. And then what you see is a map of cells that show high scores, oranges, for areas that have, on average, very narrowly distributed species. And what you see there immediately is the mountains through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and the Himalaya showing up as high scoring. So there's a lot of narrowly distributed species. You have a high proportion of endemics in Himalaya. So that's something to value.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Paul. There is a question by Prabhu Ganigar. Dr. Ganigar, you should unmute your.
Very nice, sir. Paul Williams. I would like to ask two questions. First one regarding due to climate variation, particularly in global warming in Himalayas, any extinct species of flowering crops due to that? Any extinct of bumblebees?
As I was suggesting earlier, we don't have firm data on this yet. It's unlikely that many species of bumblebees are narrowly dependent on have an obligate relationship to particular flowering plants. It seems that even in the cases that are much celebrated of species of bumblebee that have very narrow food plant selection in Northern Europe, for example, when those same species occur further south in China, they have a much broader selection of food plants. So it doesn't seem like this is an obligate relationship. This seems like it's a one that's it's what's the word? It's one of taking opportunities that are there. So they're not forced to particular plants. Now, it may be that there are particular plants in a particular high altitude which are the only important plants that can make a living there. And we might think of things like Caragana in Ladakh as being a very important food plant at around 5,000 meters, because it's producing flowers in some situations which are feeding bumblebees pretty much throughout their season. But there's really very little information, and so it's really up to you guys to find out what's going on in these fantastic systems.
Second question, what is your basic message to start beginners? What is your message to beginners to start on this bumblebees, working on taxonomy of bumblebees?
I think the most important thing that we need right now is a survey to get people out there to find out where these species are, and to produce a national database or an international database from which people can use as a resource for all their other studies. And then, of course, talks about the need for getting information on local management and how to encourage bumblebees locally, which is another problem. Is that really what you're suggesting, or are you talking more about the actual taxonomy narrowly?
Yeah, I think it is. I wanted to know how a novice can start bumblebee taxonomy.
Oh, okay, right. It's becoming increasingly difficult. Anybody can start anywhere with learning how to identify the bumblebees in their area, and that's an excellent thing to start with. And one of the things that we've had enormous success with in Britain is getting local people interested in their bumblebees, because people do tend to like bumblebees here. They're very popular. So people organize bee walks, and people who have some experience with identifying and lead these bee walks, teach people how to identify the common species, and then they learn very quickly to recognize what they have around them and to spot rare things, different things. And this is getting a lot of people interested in conserving bumblebees in Britain. It's bringing in a lot of farmers. It's bringing in a lot of people who just like to have richer environments to live in, because places that are rich in bumblebees tend to be rich in flowers, and they tend to be nice places to live. So teaching people to identify the common species of bumblebees is a great way of getting a wider audience involved and moving towards broader conservation, and eventually moving towards getting farmers and so forth involved. As if you're asking the question about how to move from that to looking at discovering species, new species, or looking at variation of the existing species, this is becoming, has to be said, increasingly complex and increasingly dependent on collaboration nationally and internationally. So the way to do that is to get involved with a group that's working on a particular problem, like some of these Himalayan bumblebees that are problematic, like Alboploralis, and seeing what can be contributed there.
Yeah, we have a question by James Mackinson. James, can you unmute your...
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, James.
Actually, hi. In my last postdoc, I was based at Rothamsted Research using the harmonic radar to track bumblebees. And
right. So you're the man to ask.
So I'm one of the people who continued on that work. But anyway, my question is actually a bit different. I was interested in cuckoo bumblebee species and whether or not there's any regional variation in the ratio of cuckoo species to non-parasitic species.
Difficult to say in any very reliable way, but the impression is that cuckoo bumblebees are often less common in the Himalaya and in China than they are in Britain. But this is very patchy. If you happen to hit a spot where a colony has been successful in rearing a lot of cuckoo bumblebees, then you'll find a lot of cuckoo bumblebees. So, yeah, it's difficult to answer that one reliably, but it is true to say that you find a lot less cuckoo bumblebees generally in collections from the Himalaya, in terms of numbers of individuals, not in terms of numbers of species, in the Himalaya and China. And somebody was talking about this the other day, and I was thinking maybe it's better to turn this around and say, well, why do you find so many in Britain? Because we can go out now and find large numbers of Cytheris vestalis on the lavender, but that's the Parasita terrestris, which is, phenomenally successful bee. And maybe that's the wrong way around, because many of the other cuckoo bumblebees in Britain really aren't that common.
Yeah, right. I guess that was going to be my follow-on question, perhaps. Say, in regions with Bombus ignorum, you would see a higher prevalence of cuckoo bumblebees. But if I can ask an additional question, I was just wondering, is there any evidence of any regionally invasive species? So, for example, similar to Bombus ignorum in the UK, are there any species which seem to be on the march throughout the Himalayas, maybe due to urbanization or human-induced movements?
Not that I know of, but other people may be in a better situation to answer that question. I haven't seen any samples of anything that suggests a big spread recently. Does anybody else have any information on that? Rifat? No?
No.
No.
Yeah, we move on to the next question. Yeah,
it might be. Sorry.
Yeah. Dr. Rajmohana has a question. Rajmohana?
Audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah,
you're audible.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very informative and interesting session, Dr. Paul. What I wanted to know is how frequent are the species discoveries in bumblebees? I meant the new taxa discoveries.
Right. As you saw from a plot earlier, based on morphological definitions of species, that the number of species being discovered during the 20th century, for example, had been slowing down. And so it was getting to the point where there was one every 2 or 3 years, perhaps. Now that people are looking at genes, then just trying to get rid of my sharing the screen.
Yeah.
So I can actually see.
Yes.
Yeah, won't do it. Can you see me?
Not.
No. Okay. Now that people have started looking at genes, there's always the risk that if it's not done carefully, that you can find lots of things that it is easy to interpret as new species, and people get very excited and start publishing all sorts of things. But as we found from looking at things like the melanobombus, if you're very careful about how it's done and look for corroboration between different sets of information, so from morphology and molecules, and ideally from looking at things like pheromones and so forth, if that's available, then yes, we are finding more species, but not at a huge rate. And most of those are things which people had known about a century ago. They're just the status of them is changing. So, for example, within the Seychelles group, various species had been lost, if you'd like. They'd been amalgamated, they'd been lumped. Whereas within the Cariensis group, the species were split, and there's 2 new species that nobody had known about before, but all the others, the other 4 within there, had all been recognized decades ago. So yes, there is a slight increase now as people look at genetic evidence, but if it's done carefully, it's not a very big increase.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Avinash Chavan has another question. Avinash?
Hello. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
You're audible, yes.
Yeah. Sir, actually, this is not a question, but a request, sir. If you have some case on bumblebee identification, especially Himalayan bumblebees, sir, can you please share it with us? Because in India, the identification of bumblebee is a very difficult task, especially based on morphological characters.
Yeah, it is. There's 2 points here. One is that, yes, I am trying to put together a guide to Himalayan bumblebees, which will be freely available. It'll be downloadable, so it wouldn't cost anything. You'd need to print it out, probably. And the other one is that once people start going on this, one of the things that's most useful is to have an online system where you can deposit barcodes. Now, not everybody has access to barcodes. I appreciate that. But if you're working in a university, these can be relatively cheap to obtain and access. And they do give a very good way of identifying an awful lot of material. They're not entirely straightforward. They need to be checked against things of known identity. And the methods used to make that comparison are not always straightforward. But nobody said any of this was going to be easy, but if you want to actually know what you're looking at properly, then there will be ways of doing this in the very near future. And I'm very happy to do whatever I can to help with that.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, there's a question by Viresh Kumar. Viresh, you're there?
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Sir, thanks for the very nice talk. Hello. Yeah, thanks for the very nice talk, sir.
Thank you.
One question: are you extracting DNA from the old museum specimens? Because we are trying here, but we are getting very poor quality DNA. So that's why I'm asking: is there any method, a specific methodology for extraction of DNA from the old museum specimens?
This is a problem. I am not a chemist. I do not do the chemistry in this. I let other people who are far cleverer than I get this sort of thing done. The way I do it personally usually is to send things to the center at Guelph in Canada. So these are the people who support the BOLD database, and they eyeball this National Barcode of Life, and they provide a service to extract DNA, and they'll put it in their database, and you can identify it from there. The people at the museum here, there is not as much interest in barcodes as there used to be, because they're seen to be as something that's not new. It's an old technology. We know how to do that. It's all straightforward and simple. You know, the action's somewhere else. But in fact, it can be quite difficult to get good barcode sequences. It's not straightforward, and it often takes a lot of effort. I can't help, I'm afraid, with how you do that. I know there are clever people who can, and the only solution that I can offer is to try somebody like Eyeball, the BOLD people at Guelph, who will provide a service to do this.
Okay. Thanks a lot, sir.
Yeah, I think Axel has a question. Axel Brockman.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Hi.
Hi, Axel.
I have a question regarding these patches of small patches in Ladakh that you demonstrated, that are like 900 meters, if I understood you correctly. So would you expect that there is inbreeding occurring in these patches? And how to say
it
that?
It doesn't sound a good situation, does it?
Interesting biological experiment, right? I mean, if you have some inbreeding, but maybe the males are flying large distance.
We don't know. We simply don't know. It's interesting that some of those species are quite widespread. So there might be a species like Bombus seminovi, which is found in Nymling, where I showed the picture. And that's a specialist in the very high plain of the Tibetan plateau. You don't find it on the outer mountain ranges at all. But it's very patchily distributed. Presumably, in former times, maybe slightly different climates, it was more widespread and more continuously distributed. And it will be very, very interesting to find out quite what the history of the vegetation and the distribution of the bumblebees over a long period, because some of these things have been there for millions of years. They're not recent colonists, and there's some evidence to suggest that the climates and vegetation have been not changing that much. I don't know. That's not my specialization, but there's a very interesting story there, and a lot more work's needed.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Okay, sorry, I can't help.
Well, a couple of questions. Oh, you have another question, Axel?
No. It was just another comment. Go ahead.
Okay. There are a couple of questions which came on YouTube by YouTube viewers. One is by Anisha Mazumdar. Do you think there is any relation between the color differences between the same species and the habitat in which they are found?
Right, yeah. I have had a look at this in the past, looking at patterns globally, and yes, I think there is. And this is a very interesting area. Partly it needs work by biologists, and partly it needs work by physicists. So from the biologists alone point of view, one of the examples I showed was very extensively yellow bumblebees, which are found in grasslands. And there's no getting away from it. When you're trying to catch bumblebees in grasslands, and they're pretty much yellow against yellow grass stems that are drying towards the end of the summer, they're difficult to see. So it looks like that's crypsis, that's camouflage, that they're hiding, they're not wanting to be caught. So presumably predation is, or something like that, is going on in those cases. The really interesting one to me is the Bumblebees of Hemorrhoidalis and some of its things that look like it, with this black thorax. And that's a color pattern that seems to be associated with low elevations. Forgive those who've heard this story before, but I remember looking at these things in Kashmir at about 1,500, 2,000 meters, I think it was, fairly low down, lower end of the forest, the coniferous forest. And these bees were active only between about 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. And at that time, they're foraging from flowers on bushes in the shade of the trees. By 9 o'clock, the sun has moved, the bushes are in the sun, and the Bumblebees Hemorrhoidalis disappear. It's presumably not a problem with the nectar or pollen availability, because there are plenty of other bees still on these bushes. It's just the bumblebees that have gone. And then in the evening, the bumblebees come back. Now, people talk about black being good for absorbing energy. And so it may be a problem to be black in bright sunlight. It may also be that if these things are equilibrating, and this is where we need the physicists, that black's very good for radiating. So it may be good if you're a bumblebee that's generating a lot of heat from flying and you're in a low elevation, warm environment. It might be good to be black to lose heat. And one of the reasons that suggests that, observe that if you like, is that all black bumblebees in the world are concentrated in the tropics at low elevations. They're not at high latitudes. They're in the tropics. So these are things in tropical forest, lowland in South America. They're in Sumatra, Java, places like that. So they tend to be darker in these very warm environments. So there may be something to do with heat exchange, heat stress that is related to color and is related to habitat. But it's complicated because this is way out of my comfort zone. It's not a smooth surface, it's got thick hair. And so there's not just absorption and radiation, but there's whatever's going on in the boundary layer within the hair with radiation and absorption and convection and conduction and goodness knows what. So we need somebody clever to sort that out.
Another question by, again, Anisha Mazumdar is that, does the color difference serve as a beneficial character for survival? Does it help in better survival?
Okay, so I've just suggested that yellow bumblebees in grasslands might be more hidden from predators because they look like their backgrounds. Just suggested that black may be better for dissipating heat if you're generating heat from flying in bumblebees at low elevation. But most bumblebees, of course, have got stripy color patterns, highly contrasting black and pale bands, yellow bands, white bands, red bands, whatever. These contrasting color patterns are particularly prevalent in mountain regions. And one possibility is that there again, it's to do with predation, that these warning bands are a warning to predators to learn to avoid things that look like that because the females sting. And this has been a popular explanation for a very long time. However, this is also where an awful lot of MSc theses go to die, because people want to study the predation. And under a lot of circumstances, if you put models out, you'd think you could make stripy models of bees and you could get the birds, which are assumed to be the major predators, to attack the models. And the birds just don't cooperate. People sit there for days and days and days and no birds attack the models. So if somebody finds a clever way of getting those sort of experiments to work, to get some data that give us some sort of information about what predators do in relation to color pattern, that would be fantastic. But beware, a lot of people have tried and failed. Excuse me.
Yeah, then there is another question by Tapan Roy. How many species have you found in Kashmir Himalayas?
Oh, I should know the answer to that. I did this revision of the Kashmir Himalaya back in 1991, and I can't remember what it was. It's like 42 or somewhere around there. And since then, there's been several others added to that list. So it's going to be 45, probably slightly more, 48, something like that at least, I should think. This is a work in progress. This is something where, you know, everybody at this meeting really needs to get involved in looking at recording bumblebees in the Himalaya and mapping where they are and sorting this out. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's the end of this thing. Thank you very much, Paul. I think Hema has, Avinash Chauhan has again raised hands. Do you have another question?
I have one question again.
Tell me.
Yeah. Sir,
Tell us.
am I audible, sir? No?
Yeah, you're audible.
Sir, actually, what I have found during my studies, with elevation or altitude, there is some difference in the size of the same species.
Okay.
So
I know nothing about this, so this is what you found. Interesting.
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
Yeah. So which species are you looking at?
Sir?
Anything's possible. It's a question of going out there and looking and replicating it in different transects in different regions and seeing how it works out. But that's fascinating, yes.
Yes, sir.
Because people talk about. Go on.
Yes,
sorry.
sir. Yes. So the base we have found at altitude of 2100 meters was smaller in size. Then we found at around 1130 meters, sir.
Okay. Right.
And on identification, they were found as Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis.
Bumblebees orientalis.
Hemorrhoidalis, sir. Both bees.
Hemorrhoidalis. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Interesting. So what you need is to look at lots of different regions and see if this is repeated in different parts of the Himalaya.
But sir, that study was only based on the morphological characters, sir, and morphometric, but not the molecular. So is it important to go for molecular also?
Well, you need to make sure that your bees are all Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis, because it may be that in some areas you get Bumblebees hemorrhoidalis and Bumblebees albipluralis, and they're both long-tongued bees and they look quite similar. But it might be there's a higher frequency of one at one elevation and a higher frequency of the other at another. And then if they were slightly different in size, you might think there's a trend in size, but it's actually a trend in species. So it is very important to be absolutely sure of which species you're dealing with. But I'm sure you did.
Yeah, and sir, one more thing. When we collect these bumblebees in the month of February, well, early spring, sir, the size of the queens were smaller. But when we collected in month of April, the size of queen was bigger. Is it also possible at the same altitude, sir?
As I say, anything is possible. Our mission is to go out and find out what's actually happening. So we keep an open mind. We go out and we look and we get evidence, we get data, and we describe what we see, and then we think about what that means. So if that's what you're finding, then that's an interesting pattern that needs an explanation, and maybe somebody can explain it. I can suggest things, but it's not my area, so it's probably not wise for me to get involved. But yeah, so good luck. Sounds great.
Yeah, because from last 7-8 years we are observing like this trend, sir.
Good, interesting.
Yeah, but I didn't find any reference for this, no, sir. That's why I'm asking from you.
Right, yeah. I'm not the person to ask, but you might try contacting people like Coulson, who's done more with colonies and ecology, and I'm trying to think who else. There might people who've been involved in rearing a lot of species in Europe and in North America. They might have observations on some of this. So they're easy enough to find on the web, but if you have difficulty, get back to me and up by email, and I'll see what I can find.
Okay, sir. And sir, the same thing we have also observed while rearing the bumblebees. In some colonies, we found this sexual production. It is in after 2 or 3 months of capturing the queen, but in some colonies it is after 8 or 9 months. So, sir, can you please tell me any probable reason why is it so?
Yeah, the person who I knew in the past who had done most with rearing bumblebee species around the world was Chris Plowright. He doesn't work with bumblebees anymore, but Chris Plowright had worked with many more than 100 species of bumblebees from different places.
Okay, sir.
And one of the things that he'd wanted to do early on, like many others, was to try and characterize colony sizes of the different species. And there's a little paper somewhere on this that he wrote. And he said that it was very frustrating because they had hundreds of species, thousands and thousands of colonies. They did this on a huge scale. And they found that the bumblebees would tended to be very, very variable in the colonies. So some species would produce big colonies, they would produce some small colonies, they produce some colonies that reared only males, some that reared only females, some that reared both, all sorts of things. So it was incredibly variable and difficult to get figures to represent what the population as a whole was doing. Partly because you need a very big sample, but also you don't know whether the sample you're getting is representative of the whole population or whether you're biasing the sampling that you're rearing without knowing it. Who knows? But it's a very complicated story.
Yes, sir. Actually, I'm facing the same problem, sir, from long time.
Yeah. So good luck.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your good suggestions, sir. And your talk was very informative, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I think it was a wonderful talk, and also wonderful. The way you answered all the questions was really very, very good. I would like to make an announcement about the next week's talk. Next week, we have a talk by Lucas Garibaldi from Argentina. He will be speaking on mutually beneficial pollinator diversity and crop yield outcomes. So that is the topic on which he will be speaking. And because he is based in South America, the time that we will be starting will be a little later, not at 5 p.m. as we did this week and the last week. It will be at 6 p.m. We'll be starting at 6 p.m. Okay, so that is the thing. And I expect Paul also to join for next week's talk. And I think Alisa also is there for today's talk, who gave the talk last week. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you very much for everybody who participated in this. And it was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.